Back in the 90s, Louis Freeh was the director of the FBI and was once well, let me back up. He was the FBI director for a long time. After the events of 9/11, he was giving congressional testimony about that horrific event. People wanted to know how on earth the most well-funded and the most sophisticated group of intelligence gathering agencies that the world has ever known failed to prevent the attacks on the World Trade Center, on the Pentagon, and the hijacking of another plane that was brought down in a Pennsylvania field by the heroics of its own passengers. After all the facts became known about those hijackers and how they prepared and how they carried out the attacks, it all seemed so obvious and so preventable. In that testimony, Louis Freeh said, collecting intelligence information is a lot like trying to drink water out of a fire hydrant. In hindsight, it's great. You've got so much stuff to look at, but the problem is at the time there's a million drops of water to swallow all at once. I've always been fascinated by history. That's where you can always find me in any bookstore, nerding out over books about the Roman Empire and such. It might have started back in grade school, reading about great conflicts and wars and calamities and social problems, and you quickly realize that almost any kind of tragic event that you can name, it could have been avoided, that the course of history is not inevitable. Those bad things that happened because of misunderstandings or miscommunication or prejudice or foolish pride or lapses in judgment. Much of the time they came about because people held on to ways of thinking that really no longer made sense, but were still a deeply held part of their identity. So as a young person reading history, your first instinct might be to say, how could all these people from history, smart people most of them, have made such awful decisions? Couldn't they see what was happening? How could they not understand the consequences of their actions? Why couldn't they just change their thinking, their assumptions, when all that seems so obvious now? Even Louis Freeh's explanation about intelligence gathering before 9/11 can feel kind of weak. The bigger the tragedy, the more we tend to think, surely this could have been avoided if only. Of course, that if only is huge. And it's not just about big tragic events, but everyday stuff. If only we had the gift of 20/20 hindsight, if only we could see into the future, if only we could program a computer to play out every conceivable outcome. But of course we don't and we can't. Day in and day out, we make hundreds of small choices, maybe a few big ones. And we don't have the benefit of time just to sit and ponder every one, or as Louis Freeh said, it's like trying to drink from a fire hydrant. We're just doing our best to discern what matters most in the midst of the flood of everything that's happening. It's only later that we have the luxury of looking back and saying, if I had taken that road instead of this one, if I had understood at the time what was really happening. The Bible is a collection of 66 very unique books, and most of them, in their own way, are telling a story and interpreting for us the meaning of the events that they are describing. Whether the authors actually say so or not, everything in the Bible is told in hindsight. So today's Palm Sunday, so we hear in all four Gospels about Jesus, less than a week before he dies, riding a donkey into Jerusalem at the start of the annual Passover celebration, when Jerusalem was just bursting at the seams with visitors. It was a big pilgrimage celebration. Now, Christian tradition calls this the triumphal entry. A crowd gathers to welcome Jesus as a hero, a prophet, maybe the long-awaited Messiah, come to take charge. Now, today when we hold a parade to honor someone, we throw confetti. Back then, they waved and laid down branches cut from palm trees, and they sang songs. According to John, the followers of Jesus who were observing all this commotion did not quite know what to make of it as it was happening. Now, Jesus had told them where to find a donkey, so they went and got one. People rode donkeys all the time. If you wanted to do that, fine. But the crowd, the songs, the parade, what was that all about? Just a spontaneous thing because people were in a celebratory mood? John tells us that only later, in hindsight, did they put the pieces together, that there was an old prophecy and a tradition that conquering kings came into the capital city of Jerusalem in precisely that way. It was only later they understood that Jesus was intentionally playing out a role, that he was making a very public statement. And yet, if he was claiming to be a king, no one would understand until later that his kingdom did not fit the usual definition. He wasn't one who sought or claimed power in the way that we think of power, just as he had done as long as they had known him. He was challenging the very ways of being that everyone else just took for granted. Think of all the times he spoke by saying, "Now you've heard it said," and then he would go on to state a well-known rule that was just common wisdom. But then he'd say, "But I say to you," and completely turn that rule or that common wisdom upside down. So this parade, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, that was no different. He might as well have been saying, "You've heard it said that a king, a conquering powerful hero, arrives in this way. But I say to you, that's not what my kingdom is about. Let me show you what it's about." He was changing history by changing the way we think and changing what we believe and assume about who we are, our very identity, about why we're here, and about our relationship to each other and to God. Changing all of that from the belief that life is about what we can get to the truth that life is about what we can give away in love. That what matters most is loving and serving others. Jesus, at a particular moment in history, proved that the course of history is not inevitable, that we're never destined to be stuck in ways of living and being if we understand what matters most. Truth is, we are still very challenged to hear that message clearly because we're all creatures of conventional wisdom. We all live subjective lives. Everything is literally from our point of view. That's why it's so hard to break out of ways of thinking and being that aren't really very good for us or very good for others. I'm reading a new book by Adam Grant. It's called Think Again. I love Adam Grant. He's an organizational psychologist who teaches at the Wharton School of Business. A lot of what I'm going to say next comes straight from this book, direct quotes, so I want to give credit where it's due. Okay? Adam starts out by telling a story from a book that's about smoke jumpers, the people who jump from planes to fight forest fires. This book is called Young Men in Fire. It was written by Norman MacLean. He tells the story about, in August of 1949, a crew of 15 smoke jumpers, led by a man named Wagner Dodge, leapt from an airplane into a huge fire on the slopes of a canyon in western Montana. Not long after parachuting in, the men were in trouble. The fire was way too large and way too hot and quickly moving up the slope of tall, dry grass where they were located. Their only hope was to outrun it by reaching the crest of the hill. Wagner Dodge ordered the men to abandon their firefighting gear so they could move faster, but most of them didn't do that. When Dodge saw that the fire would overcome them soon, he dropped and he began lighting matches all around to catch the grass that was immediately around him on fire. His men just didn't understand what he was doing or why he was doing it, but what he was doing was creating a burnt-out zone, a buffer of grass already burned where they would all be safe. None of the others joined him there. 2 of the firefighters were barely able to make it over the ridge to safety, but 12 of the men, trying to outrun the blaze and running right past Wagner Dodge, all died. After it was all over, there was a lot of controversy and an official investigation, and Dodge said he had never heard of setting a fire to create an escape zone before. It just seemed like him to be the logical thing to do. It wasn't a method approved by the Forest Service. Neither was dropping your firefighting equipment in order to run faster. Adam Grant tells this story as an example of rethinking. He writes that we hesitate at the very idea of rethinking. In studies of high school and college test takers, the conventional wisdom is that on multiple choice exams, it's usually a very bad idea to go back and change your previous answer. You're told that revised answers are more likely to be wrong. The statistics prove just the opposite. Most answer revisions actually go from being wrong to being right. Adam says believing that you're likely to be wrong if you go back and change your answer is called the first instinct fallacy. It's not that the second answers are inherently better, they're only better because students are so reluctant to switch that they only make changes when they're fairly confident. So it's not so much that changing your answer improves your score, it's considering whether you should change it that makes the difference. So that means we don't just hesitate to rethink our answers, we hesitate at the very idea of rethinking itself. We often prefer the ease of hanging on to old views, old assumptions, old beliefs over the difficulty of grappling with brand new ones. But there are deeper forces behind our resistance to rethinking. Because questioning things makes the world feel a lot more unpredictable. It requires us to admit that the facts may have changed, that what was once right may now be wrong. Reconsidering something we believe deeply can threaten our very identity, making it feel as if we're losing a part of ourselves. Adam Grant says that's not true with everything in our lives, of course. We're quick to change our clothes to be in vogue or to update our kitchens or bathrooms, but when it comes to our knowledge and our opinions, we tend to stick to our guns. Psychologists call this seizing and freezing, he says. We favor the comfort of conviction over the discomfort of doubt. We listen to views that make us feel good instead of ideas that make us think hard. Once we hear a story and accept it as being true, we rarely bother to question it. Now, in the wildfire story, Adam Grant writes, the smoke jumpers had a decision to make. They didn't have the luxury of time to analyze the situation and consider their options. With the fire raging close by, they had no chance to stop and think. And Wagner Dodge made it out alive, not because he was smarter, but because he was able to rethink faster. For the firefighters who didn't make it out alive, Wagner Dodge's decision didn't make sense to them. They could not rethink their assumptions in time. Under stress, we tend to revert to our well-learned automatic responses. Run away from the fire, for instance. Hang on to your equipment, even if it's holding you back. Dodge survived because he overrode those responses. No one had taught him to build an escape fire. It was pure improvisation. Adam Grant also writes that the COVID pandemic has caused so many of us to rethink our assumptions, things we had long taken for granted. Things like that it's safe to visit a hospital or go to a restaurant, that it's safe to hug our parents, that you can attend concerts or go to church, that most of us will never work remotely, most of us will never homeschool our own kids. He reminds us that this past year we've had to rethink what racial injustice means. It's fairly safe to say. Most of us were aware that it existed, but before the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, it rarely hit home, for most white people at least, that systemic racism in America is an evil that we must actively work to eradicate. And it's not only an issue for people of color. We've had to rethink assumptions about what it means to be patriotic. Just having a discussion about kneeling during the national anthem can end a friendship. Just having a conversation about who really won the presidential election, that can tear a family apart. So we've had to rethink in real time, and I'm thankful for a book like Think Again to help me process what we've been through and the road that we are continuing to travel. So it makes me wonder how this long moment will be recorded in our history books. Will people look back at you and me and list all the things that happened that could have been avoided? The things we did because of misunderstandings or miscommunication or prejudice or foolish pride or lapses in judgment? The things we did because we held on to ways of thinking that no longer made sense but were such a deeply held part of our identity? You bet they will. Because we don't have the luxury of 20/20 hindsight. However, Each and every one of us does have the capacity to rethink, even as we're still in the midst of this very weird and hard moment. We have the ability to prove that history is not inevitable, that we're never destined to be stuck in ways of living and ways of being. If the thing that drives our decision making, our thinking, our believing is grounded in the truth that life is about what we can give rather than what we can get, and that what matters most is loving and serving others, then the kingdom Jesus came to proclaim, where the only rule is love, that's going to be the history that we make.